The last time Australia faced the direct threat of war, this was our parliament. Here, ministers, members and senators grappled with the darkest days in our nation's history. As Japan surged through Southeast Asia, bombed down north and landed in New Guinea, Australia confronted the limits of its reliance on Britain. Prime Minister John Curtin made the fateful turn to Washington, declaring that Australia looks to America to secure our defence. It was a strategic shift born of desperation, which evolved into an alliance that has endured to this day. Today, Australia faces the greatest threat to peace in our region since the Second World War. Our largest trading partner, China, is locked in a global struggle with our long-standing ally, the United States. Beijing grows more assertive, Washington more unpredictable. So Sky News has returned to this house to convene our own War Cabinet. It includes a former Labor Defence Minister, Australia's longest-serving Foreign Minister, a naval strategist, experts in cyber and drone warfare, 3 national security advisors who've served at the highest levels of government, and a retired Army General. Welcome to the Cabinet Room in Old Parliament House, where we gather to discuss perhaps the most consequential question of our age. Are we ready for war? To get the view of the terrain as the government sees it, let's hear from our Defence Minister, Richard Marles.
The most complex strategic circumstances since the end of World War II has demanded the biggest reassessment of our strategic posture in 35 years.
So a massive challenge then. And when we discuss defence, it's quite often talked about in terms of how much we should spend in terms of our whole economy, what we call gross domestic product. So let's have a look at some of the numbers and how 3 nations stack up. First, of course, no one spends more than the United States of America, with a massive percentage of its gross domestic product. Then, if you look at it just in terms of that kind of figure, Australia actually looks reasonably good. It spends 1.9% of its GDP. But let's have a look at that now in real dollar terms. The United States spends about $1 trillion. We spend $36 billion, and China $314 billion. Now, we'll get to whether or not that's enough money soon, but let's have a look at the level of threat as our panel sees it first. And Joel Fitzgibbon, you were a former Labor Defence Minister. You commissioned a Defence White Paper back in 2009 when it was published. It saw the threat of China rising. It talked about a larger amount of defence spending. So how do you see the threat level now?
And if you'll indulge me, Chris, if that white paper had been fully funded, we'd be in a better position now. But this is, of course, a very complex area of public policy, and there are plenty of views. But I think there are 2 indisputable facts. The first is that the strategic outlook in the region is deteriorating rather markedly. The second fact is that the warning time we can expect for a threat is growing much shorter. Now, there can be lots of responses to that, but building on that, there are 2 fundamental points. We need to keep the United States engaged in our region. We cannot allow a hegemony to develop, particularly a hegemon that's not democratic in our region. That means keeping the Americans here. That means we need to do more of the heavy lifting, engage more with the US, and become more interoperable with the US. The second thing we need to do, of course, is to build a force capable of deterring and denying a threat. That means, of course, spending more, spending smarter, and being more creative about the way we spend, and to spend far more efficiently. Now, the government is spending a lot more money. It is doing a lot more, but I think the strategic outlook tells us that we'll need to do even more again.
Alexander Downer, you're our longest-serving Foreign Minister. How do you see the world?
Well, I agree that I think the strategic circumstances are difficult, if not dangerous. There are obviously hot wars in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and there's quite a serious risk in East Asia of war breaking out over Taiwan. So there are a couple of thoughts that I think people need to keep in their heads when thinking about this. The first is the linkages between countries that we might describe as adversaries, between China, North Korea, Iran and Russia. Strategically, these countries, they have very different interests, but strategically these countries are linked up. Secondly, we have to be robust in our support for liberal democracy and for our values against the threats from these people. And the only way to do that is to operate in a strong global alliance led by the United States for very obvious reasons, but to make sure we, as Australia, make a serious contribution to that alliance. And if this alliance holds, if it's properly cemented, if it's well led by the Americans, and if we as members of the alliance are serious about making a practical contribution to defence through our spending and our equipment, then we will maintain a balance of power in the world, and that will be a force for peace. But if we fail on any of those things, then the risks are huge.
Mike Pazula, you were the lead author in that 2009 Defence White Paper. You've been the head of Home Affairs. When Beijing sent warships to lap Australia and have a live fire exercise off our coast at the beginning of this year, what message was Beijing sending us?
Well, first and foremost, it was an attempt to project power in the sense that we would recognise it as their ability to do that, to coerce us potentially. But I suspect as they were doing their operation, they were probably also in the hull of the ship, inside the ship, rehearsing missile strikes, because you wouldn't go all the way down here and not actually practice the very thing that particularly the principal ship was designed to do, which is to fire a very large number of land attack missiles. On the question of threat, Australia is an incredibly secure country. We would not be having this conversation but for one factor. If we were dealing with the China that Bob Hawke, Paul Keating and John Howard were dealing with, technocratic China, focused on prosperity, on lifting the living standards and eradicating poverty, I'd find it very hard. As someone who actually was the lead defence planner when Joel Fitzgibbon was the minister, I could not justify us spending the amount of money that we're spending now on defence. In other words, we're spending enough to hedge a future threat, but the fact that we've got a different China than the China that Hawke, Keating and Howard dealt with, that's a swing factor.
Dr. Alexandra Malloy, you are an expert in drone warfare, but you're a Ukrainian Australian. You've been on the front line in Ukraine. Is there any doubt in your mind that China is working with Russia in that war?
Look, I think that one of these strategic challenges that we experience is really that combination of China working with Russia, apart from North Korea and Iran working with Russia. And this emergent axis is quite concerning. There was an evidence that China was supporting their dual-use technology and supporting Russia in their war against Ukraine. And more so, Chinese citizens were reportedly in the front line alongside Russia. Apart from them, Chinese military officers have been learning alongside Russia the tactical lessons, and they continue doing so. And I think that's although China take that neutrality concerns, it's really concerning for Australia as well.
And just one other thing, you're completely right. And China is buying Russian oil. So in effect, China is financing Russia's war in Ukraine. Don't forget that.
In addition to other countries.
In addition to other countries.
And Catherine Manstead, you look not just the real world, but the virtual world. Could we say, in some ways, that we're already at war?
We're certainly not at peace. And when we're talking about complex geostrategic circumstances, there's a temptation to think we're talking about things out there, not already on the home front. But we know in Australia that actively Chinese military cyber spies are actively probing our civilian critical infrastructure, looking for weaknesses and looking for ways to get in and hide and bide, potentially for high impact sabotage if relations deteriorate in the region.
Ross Babbage, you have briefed people in this room, or in this building, I should say, so you've got a long history of working with government and being a strategic analyst. How is the world as you see it?
Look, I think it's got a lot worse, the overall strategic environment. There's no question about that. But I think the major change for us is just the rapid growth and the breadth of the growth of the defence and related capabilities that the Chinese have invested in and are investing in. And it's not just military. They've been changing the structure of their economy to be able to conduct a major military operation and sustain it indefinitely pretty well. So we've seen big changes in infrastructure, which they've actually announced publicly are being driven and intentionally being driven by strategic imperatives for a potential conflict on an equal basis for economic development. And that's changing a lot. And they're also preparing their community to psychologically for tough times that may come. So we're looking at the possibility of a serious crisis.
Mick Ryan, you're a former general. How do you see it as a military conflict? What do you see when you look around the world at the build-up that we're looking at the moment?
Well, what I see at the moment is something that I think most Australians don't perceive, which is a global adaptation war, where Iran, North Korea, China and Russia are collaborating to learn from each other. They've established a knowledge market in battlefield tactics, in technologies, in strategic coercion, in misinformation, in defence production, in a way that we just haven't seen before. And that allows them to learn from each other, whether it's in Ukraine, the Middle East, or even in their Western Pacific operations, and do so at a speed that is incomprehensible to most bureaucrats in this country. And unfortunately, I think the greatest threat that we face is complacency. Too many people in this country either believe there is not a threat or they act as if there is not a threat.
Jennifer Parker, former naval officer and marine strategist. Do we forget sometime that part of our anthem that says we're girt by sea?
We certainly do, and we have historically, to be honest, forgotten about the fact that you don't need to step foot on Australia to impact Australia's security or its economy. All you need to do is strangle it. And there's a famous quote by an old dead admiral that talks very much about this, Alfred Thayer Mahan. Look, I think that we need to think about the concept of conflict differently, our vulnerabilities differently. Too often I hear but Australia won't be invaded. And that's true, right? But Australia is already in a contestation in the cyber domain, already in a contestation in the space domain, and the maritime domain isn't far off that. So I think we need to think about conflict differently and more broadly. I think we also focus a lot on China. China is clearly an aggressive threat in our region, and its behaviour really does impact our national interests and will continue to do so. But I think there's another trend too that we need to think about, which is the general breakdown of international law in the increasing commonality of states resorting to the use of force. And this is a trend that isn't just China. It is Russia, illegal invasion of Ukraine. It's recently Cambodia and Thailand. It is Pakistan and India. So this is a broader concern. And I think Australia needs to wake up to the fact that the world is changing and our way that we embrace it and we think about defence needs to change.
And Peter Jennings, you worked in the Department of Defence. You also ran one of Australia's leading think tanks. How worried should we be?
Oh, we should certainly be worried. And I think a point to bring out is this is not a story about the 2030s. Our concern needs to be in the second half of this decade. Essentially, whilst Xi Jinping is still the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. And as our colleagues have said, Chris, this is everything about China positioning to be the dominant strategic power in our part of the world by military force if necessary. And it is utterly false for our government to say that somehow they have stabilised the relationship with China. Things may have improved on the trade front, but that is at the expense of ignoring the strategic developments which all of our colleagues around the table have spoken about, which is China is positioning for war.
Okay, well, let's look at our state of readiness when it comes to measuring it against the sorts of troops that we might be up against. So let's look at the active military personnel. This is the boots on the ground. America has a lot. We have very few, and look at that. Of course, China can always put more people in more places. What about Navy, surface ships? Well, the United States usually leading on that front. We don't have that many at all. And China, despite defence spending, well ahead of the United States when it comes to that. What about submarines? Well, the USA, we know, has nuclear submarines. We've got 6 ageing submarines, and China has 61 very capable submarines. What about combat aircraft now? The United States, again, leads on this front. We have 250, and China a whole lot less than the US. So on that, at least the United States seems to be in front. But the question now is one of readiness. Are we ready to fight a war, Mick Ryan?
I think there's a few dimensions of readiness you need to consider here. I think the most important one is not numbers of things. It is the numbers of good ideas. And do we have the right warfighting concepts for the 21st century that bring in more creative ways of integrating big exquisite things with mass cheap things, be they drones or new munitions, new ideas about how we work with different partners in the region. So readiness has an intellectual dimension, and it has a dimension of how well ready are we to fight tonight, as we say. And we need to ensure that if something happens, we're prepared overnight to make big decisions as a government and as a military.
I mean, you can't build the capability or the force we need unless you've got the strategy or the strategic assessment correct. The DSR, the Defence Strategic Review, was the last big look. Angus Houston and Stephen Smith. Do you think it got it right?
I think it got it partially right. I mean, it's like a lot of government reviews, it's a bit right and a bit wrong. I think its inability to look beyond the region for lessons was a shortfall. Ukraine didn't get mentioned once, and there are a lot of lessons from the Middle East we need to be learning through the right filters, of course. So it was partially right, but there are lots happened since 2024 as well.
Jennifer.
Look, I think that the idea of some nebulous strategy of deterrence is really a challenge, right? Anyone that studies deterrence theory knows that deterrence relies on specificity. So I think there's a problem with that. In terms of did it get it right, look, it moved along the journey, but the force structure from the DSR is actually very similar to the force structure we've had for the last 40 years. So I think that we need to broaden our conversation about the capabilities we need. I agree with Mick, comparing it to China isn't useful, but comparing it to the missions we need to do to protect Australia's interests, that would be useful, and we're not there.
I think this notion of a focus force was interesting but insufficient. Two problems with a focus force. One is it's assuming exactly we know what we're going to do, which we don't. We always get surprised, so it removes your options for adapting to surprise. But secondly, the structure that's in the National Defence Strategy of 2024 is a balanced force.
Okay.
It's not a focus force.
Look, I think one of the really important points here is I don't think enough officials and enough Australians generally are studying closely what's actually going on in China and how they plan to operate in a crisis. And I think we tend to assume too readily, and I'm not suggesting about the people around the table here today, but there's too much of a tendency to assume that they're thinking about these issues the same as we are. They are not. They're thinking quite differently. Catherine was right when she talked about the cyber and the penetration that we're seeing today, the sabotage preparations we're seeing, the sleeper cells, a whole raft of other things we're well aware of. These are preparations for potential crisis and for conducting a much broader conflict and also being able to sustain a conflict, because in the West, the US and ourselves tend to focus on the first battle. Well, the first battle is not enough. And we are not preparing and working adequately on things like supply chains and resilience.
Catherine.
Yeah, I might just add 2 points there. In your balance there, you missed the cyber dimension. And one of the greatest strengths of the US in the 20th century was its military industrial complex. China now has an intelligence industrial complex. It's not just China that are the master hackers. It has invested in building an entire ecosystem. And to Mick's point, we can have the best tanks, the best subs, the best concepts. But if we have lost the IP of what those concepts and that material is, we'll be out of the fight on day one.
In terms of readiness, one of the things we've got to contemplate is the deeply secure nature of Australia. Australia is a very secure country. There's only one circumstance in which we've got any immediate concerns. If I was a Chinese planner, the only reason why I would bother about attacking Australia kinetically is that if there are US forces here. They're the only things I'm going to be worried about. Because I can put enough pressure on Australia through cyber means, through political subversion, through interference in the diaspora, through space engagement, some of the things other colleagues have talked about. I don't need to worry about the ADF. It's frankly too small. So the big sea change that's happened in this country since about 2010, 2011 was, and I support this, I should say, but it has increased the risk profile. As we've moved from joint facilities that were in the background, invisible, no one knew much about what was happening at Pine Gap and Northwest Cape, as US force initiatives have come in, so bomber capability, submarines, that's what's getting us drawn into potentially a fight. The Americans are certainly going to rely on that geography in any fight. That's what we've got to be thinking about.
All right, Peter.
Well, what gets us drawn into a fight is the more aggressive behaviour of China in the region.
Indeed.
And our preparations for that, frankly, reflect a kind of a niche military investment which the broader country doesn't understand. You know, my concern here is I see a defence force which is actually less ready for military operations than it was 5, 10 and 15 years ago. But I see an Australian population which is completely untutored in terms of thinking about these issues. When I go out to speak, audiences are really enormously surprised at the extent to which things are working against us in terms of our strategic view. Our people are not prepared, and that's because our government is not preparing them.
And on that front, Dr. Malloy, there's a war going on at the moment in Ukraine. Has Australia made enough of studying what's happening on that battlefield?
Look, I think that Australia, along with other countries, are doing their lessons and they're learning and observing. And I think I'd like to highlight, but we need to translate those lessons in the context and learn together with Ukrainian from Ukraine. So I think we can and we should do more. And on the previous point, I think the most important aspect is that a rapidly changing nature of the modern warfare. I think we can really get stuck in the previous strategies and policies, but it is continuously changing and we need to keep up with the innovation and adaptation and also have that willingness to learn, but most importantly, to find the ways, how is it possible to scale up the production, the military, the workforce.
I don't think we should think of all of these issues as Australia alone. We need to think about it in the context of our alliances. Because, I mean, if we're going to provide counterweight to China, obviously Australia alone is not going to do that. That balance of power, I use that expression, that balance of power will involve the United States, but also countries like Japan and to some extent increasingly now India and others, I mean Philippines and so on. So when we're talking about defence capability, we need to think about how we would work in with all of those countries, not just with the Americans, but principally with the Americans. So, for example, working in with the Japanese. I mean, I really applaud the present government's decision to buy the Japanese frigates. I think that is a hugely sensible thing. But more than that, it really welds us to the Japanese. And I'm very focused on this building alliances, strengthening alliances, collaborating with alliances, and thereby providing the balance of power we need. So defence capability needs to be looked at in that context.
And so on buying kit, the biggest bit of kit that we're buying is from the United States. It's submarines which are over the horizon. Now, we don't have an enormous amount of time, but headlines, please, from people. Is our concentration on submarines distorting our defence spending and making us look too long-term when the threat is short-term?
Chris, it's not helping us for the 2020s, and that's the problem. I have no argument against the AUKUS submarine design, but we won't see that until the 2040s. We need to deal with a threat which is much more real in the short term.
Okay, a quick hit from everybody.
I think the opportunity cost is bigger than the return on investment for these submarines, at least for the next decade, with a range of other ADF capabilities that are desperately needed.
I honestly think the headlines are generally fairly false when we talk about AUKUS. AUKUS is actually providing capability in 2027. It's just not the capability we want because we don't control it. But if you think about Australia's vulnerabilities, this is what we've never really been able to grapple with in terms of our strategy. We are vulnerable in the maritime domain. And so investment in submarines is important. And we're making assumptions about, I don't subscribe to the 2027 window. Conflict is increasingly likely, yes, but planning a force that's about a push for the next 5 years and forgetting the next 20 years of competition would be a struggle. So we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
I don't think anyone's saying we forget beyond 2030, but the most important time to deter the Chinese is now,
okay, Ross.
not in 5 years.
Well, I mean, that's an open debate.
Yep.
Well, one way we can help deter the Chinese is maintaining the strength of the alliance and doing what we can to reinforce it. But I think the other thing, too many people, think about AUKUS as being, well, the first submarine won't arrive in the current schedule till about 2032, the first Virginia. Well, actually, that's not strictly true. The first jointly crewed submarines will actually have 5 here within 3 years from now, in 2028. There'll be 4 Virginians that will be jointly crewed. They won't have an Australian ensign on the back. but they'll be jointly crewed.
I think we have to see where the US review goes, Ross. That's not set in concrete by history.
Nothing much is said in concrete in this world, but the point I'm simply saying is we are not defenceless between now and then.
The AUKUS submarine decision is the right decision. If you go, I said we need to maintain the strategic balance in our region. We need to be better embedded with in partnership, strengthen our partnership with the United States. It's a miraculous capability which we never thought we'd have access to. So gaining access was too good a gift to pass on. In 10 years' time, they'll be spending twice what we were when they came to office, but it's clearly not going to be enough.
We have a media and a political obsession with big things, and I think the subs get all the oxygen out of AUKUS. It's worth remembering there's a Pillar 2 around advanced technological collaboration as well. So to Jen's point, there's capability now in Pillar 1, but also we can't forget Pillar 2.
My worry is that so much of the defence budget is being diverted into this project to build the submarines in Adelaide. Look, I hate to say this, but because I come from Adelaide, I was born there. But honestly, it is a huge financial indulgence to build them in Adelaide. And unless you massively increase the defence budget to cover that and to ensure that we get all the other defence capabilities we need, it's going to create a great hole in our defence force.
All right, so the thing we all agree on is the threat is real and that we may not have much time. So when we come back from the break, we'll look at the worst case scenario. What happens if China invades Taiwan? Welcome back. Well, it's always best to hope for the best and plan for the worst, and that's what we're going to look at the moment. What would happen if China invaded Taiwan? Peter Jennings, you've looked at this, so take us through the worst case scenario.
So, Chris, it's far from being the only scenario that we should think about, but an attack on Taiwan, I think, is perhaps the most likely flashpoint for a conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And most likely, we know this from China's behaviour over the last few years, it would start with a blockade, cutting of the internet cables into Taiwan, stopping air traffic and sea traffic into Taiwan. And from there, I think China would seek to win its objectives without military force, but if it couldn't do that, it would then launch significant missile strikes onto the air bases and the port facilities, attacking the Taiwanese military, and attacking Taiwan's senior leadership. And then, much as Russia tried but failed to do in 2022, it might send in airborne forces to kill the political leadership and the senior military leadership of the Taiwanese government. I think only towards the end of that first stage of a conflict would we see a significant amphibious assault. And really what China would be looking to do would be to take over ports and airfields so it could land its forces that way. And the last possible thing that they would consider would be across the beach military landings. Whilst this is happening, the other thing China would be doing would be working as hard as it could to keep the Americans away, to keep Japan away, to use political and diplomatic means to try and keep Australia and any other democracy out of the conflict. That's how I think this would unfold in its early stages.
So the question for this cabinet is this something that Australia could sit out? And Jennifer Parker, could you kick us off and then everyone?
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. Look, there are a lot of debates about how this could unfold. I think a blockade, to be honest, is quite unlikely because it allows countries that may choose to intervene time to choose how they intervene. I think we need to be very careful that it may involve a quick strike. And if it involves a quick strike, that's a difficult invasion of Taiwan. That's 100 nautical miles across the strait for a difficult island. I find it highly unlikely that if China makes that decision, I don't think they've made it yet, that they wouldn't necessarily attack Japanese and US forces in the vicinity, which means it is a regional conflict and it's not a decision about whether Australia is involved. Our ally and two partners have been attacked and the region is now in conflict, and that really impacts our national interest. So I think it's going to be broader and a lot quicker.
Mike?
Well, I think the counterfactual just needs to be considered, just to answer your question. How do we avoid it? So let's step back from the question of whether we should be in, or to Alexander's point about using a coalition to try to deter or defeat this. Let's say there's a government here that wants to sit it out. Here's what they'd have to do. They'd almost have to immediately abrogate the key provisions of ANZUS, because ANZUS actually requires more than consultation. It requires us to act together to meet a common danger, which includes an armed attack on one or the other party, including its armed forces in the Pacific area. So there's a treaty issue. The Americans would be entitled, unless we ripped up the treaties and closed Pine Gap and Northwest Cape down, to keep using those facilities to support their war operations, both Pine Gap and Northwest Cape. Northwest Cape, famously, going right back to Mr. Whitlam's day, communicates to US nuclear submarines, including with missile launch orders. Then the point of discretion that a government might have is to say no to forced projection from Australia. That would be a very, very big decision to take, to say no, you can't launch your submarines from Stirling, nor transit your B-2 bombers, say, through Tyndall.
Mick?
I think two other things to take into consideration here. The first one is it's very unlikely that if Xi did make this decision, it would just be a China on America thing. There would be strategic distractions on the Korean Peninsula and in Europe, which Australia would also have to think very seriously about. But the most important thing is Xi has to be absolutely assured that he will be successful. Whether he goes short or goes long, with a bolt from the blue or protracted conflict, he absolutely must be assured that he will be successful, because his position rests on it, and the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party probably does too. So the more we can influence his determination to do that and deter him personally from doing this, the better off the whole region will be.
Well, as we are saying about the working in alliance with other countries, I think that goes without saying China is thinking about that too. And we're coming back to the comments that we made in the beginning of the session. So China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, so how that unfolds will be absolutely concerning. And let's not forget that the threat to Australia is closer than we think. So think about last year, November, exercises of Russia and Indonesia. We should not forget about that fact. And although remaining non-aligned to any policy, so they're still doing these exercises. More than that, Russia has officially requested to place their military planes, nuclear bombers and military transport planes on their bases. So they rejected today, but it doesn't mean that it will not change tomorrow.
Ross?
I think, can we sit this out? My view is we really can't. And Mike was right about the alliance. You'd have to effectively abrogate a lot of it. And I just point out to everybody in the recent Lowy Institute poll that 80% of the public said that they regarded the ANZUS alliance, or alliance with the United States, to be either important or very important for Australia's security. I think I think the public would be in outrage if any government in current circumstances tried to walk away from the alliance relationship.
I think this is completely right. I don't think we would have any choice but to support the Americans in this scenario. But how would the scenario unfold will depend on how the Americans would react to it. See, I don't think it would be just a simple blockade. If I were developing China's strategy, what I would start to do is intercept shipping going into Taiwan for customs inspections and the like. So you wouldn't blockade it, but you would be disrupting it. And that would lead to a reaction from Taiwan, which might, of course, in turn lead to a reaction from the Americans. Though the Americans would be unsure. I know this from talking to the Americans about this Taiwan scenario. They seem quite unsure about what the president in the end would do. And it is true, though, that we either have an alliance or we don't have an alliance, and we need to think about that. If we decide we're not going to work with the Americans when the Americans get into conflicts, then we shouldn't bother with an alliance anymore, and we should just hope that the rest of the world will go away from us. I think it would be an absurd and reckless decision for an Australian government to make not to support the Americans in this situation.
I just want to pick up on the public dimension Ross mentioned. Whatever the crisis or contingency, whether it's military or non-military in Taiwan or anywhere in our region, I don't think that the Chinese government will wait for Australia to decide in or out. They will be actively coercing and influencing our decision-making capability from day zero. That's political subversion, that's potential sabotage, that's cyber disruption. You only need to look at what Russia is doing across Europe at the moment, one of the most unprecedented and reckless sabotage sprees in world history, to know that that type of domestic interference is completely normalised as far as authoritarian governments are concerned. So Australia, in some sense, and the Australian public, has such a huge stake in these conversations, because it's not just about kind of military decisions, kind of pushing troops around with a stick on a table, thinking about these things. These will affect real people, real businesses.
I just do want to pick up on one point Mike Pizzullo made earlier. He said that the presence of US forces and AUKUS, draw us further into it. And for your viewers at home, I just want to reinforce that, in my view, I very strongly believe that maintaining the strategic balance in the region is our best deterrence. So I think that, I don't think Mike was saying otherwise, I'm sure he wasn't, but just for your viewers, that to understand that it's not a reason not to be strengthening our relationship with the US. On the public perception, this would be difficult. I think the days of war being simple in terms of public perception, just driven by all-in patriotism, might be behind us. And it would be a hard sell to explain why we are spending so much blood and treasure on an island state that we recognise as part of China, and in fact the US and the UK and all our major allies and partners recognise as being part of China. So it would be a difficult one to prosecute in the public marketplace. And Alex and I both sat in the National Security Committee of the Cabinet. We know how difficult these decisions can be. This would be a very difficult position, but I agree with the collective that just as NATO countries have been charged with seeking the security guarantee without doing the heavy lifting, we would need to be true and fully committed to our alliance relationship.
I just want to disagree with only one thing there. I don't think it would be a very hard sell with the public. I think when the war erupted, the public would be outraged at what China had done. They would be outraged, and they would very strongly support our involvement and America's engagement, and Japan's, by the way.
I think the lesson from the last couple of decades is that Western publics do go all in to support these kind of things where they see the right purpose. And if you talk to some senior people in Ukraine, none of them predicted that young Ukrainians wouldn't rally to the flag. So I think we can expect in the initial phases there would be broad public support, but sustaining that, given the lack of strategic patience in most
But I want to pick up on something
would be the problem.
that Alexander. I want to pick up on something that Alexander said, though. It is a United States under Donald Trump. So we've been thinking about the threat that comes from China, and I'll go to Peter Jennings on this as well. I know you've got another point there, Peter, but we now have a mercurial White House. How much does that change our equation?
I think that's less important than people imagine, because the test for the United States is not so much about the defence of Taiwan, it's about the defence of their own position as a global superpower. And are they prepared to see that eroded by China being victorious in this part of the world? It's a critical question, though, Chris, because I think, what we need to do here is try to get into the mind of Xi Jinping. And his ideology says that the West is in terminal decline, the US is in terminal decline. I think he misreads the US and the West. But that's very dangerous, because if he thinks he can get away with an attack because the Americans and the Allies won't oppose it, then that is going to make his choice easier. The choice that Mick was talking about is something that he has to be guaranteed of success before he goes in.
This is the essential point, I think, that any war that does happen, hopefully it doesn't, will start through miscalculation by at least one side.
Yes.
And deterrence is all about reducing the risk of miscalculation.
Okay, Jennifer and then Ross.
I want to pick up on this alliance theme for a little bit, because there is this growing rhetoric that I hear in Australia that it is our relationship with the US that is putting us in danger. And I just want to kind of flip that in terms of it is actually our relationship with the US that actually has allowed us to be so protected in many ways. And I think we need to be very careful with the alliance. I think the alliance is in our interest, but we aren't abrogating our responsibilities to the alliance. And I think there's a danger there that actually since the 90s, with our reduction in investment capability, we are relying too much on the US. And I think that's the conversation we need to be having.
Ross.
I just want to make the point that if there were to be such a crisis, it wouldn't just be the United States who has a seat at the table in a way. And I emphasise in particular, obviously the Taiwanese, their capacity to strengthen and operate effectively in their own domain. It's not insignificant. But let me remind everybody that the Japanese have a very strong stake and have a very special relationship with the Taiwanese, and they are unlikely to sit on their hands. And if the Japanese are committing themselves and others in the region, then it's extremely unlikely, even if there was some hesitancy in the White House, it's very unlikely that the United States would stay aloof. And besides, they are making this theatre the prominent and the dominant area for their investment and their planning and their force structure development posture.
I just want to pick up a point that Catherine drew out earlier, which I think is really important. Probably not on day zero, but day -0. I think there'd be a concerted effort by China to get inside our heads through subversion, through diaspora, etc. And the point would be, and a clever Chinese play would be, hopefully there's not too many of them watching this
big listenership there,
would be to actually say to Australia, look, we accept the joint facilities that have been there for a long time. You're not going to kick those out. However, strikes against our forces, or our mainland, even worse, from Australia, you will pay for centuries. Now, we've got 2 former cabinet ministers around the table. They'd have to consider, the current decision makers would have to consider that threat to say, OK, I get it. To Jennifer's point, we have to go all in on the alliance, because if we're supporting strikes from Australia, that will resonate for decades, indeed centuries. That, I think, is actually the key decision, which isn't Australian forces striking. There might be an element of that. It's US forces striking from Australia. That is the question.
OK, well, we've asked plenty of questions. Up next, we'll discuss what are some of the solutions. What should we be doing to prepare ourselves for war? Welcome back to the Cabinet Room in Old Parliament House, where we have convened our own War Cabinet. And we've been talking about what the level of threat is, how much time we might have and how ready we are. And I think we all are in agreement around this table, at least, that we are not ready. But we want to have now some solutions. So we'll start with you, Catherine. What would you be doing right now to make us ready?
And let me phrase that as ready to avoid war, hopefully, rather than ready to participate in war. But look, I think something that's come out across this conversation is how we get better at talking about the China threat publicly, how we break through that complacency that we see. And there's been a lot of debate in this country, politicised debate, about whether we take the Scott Morrison approach of confronting China or the current government's approach of being more conciliatory. And China is very good at having a view on that by having confected fake outrage whenever we call out China. But the key point I want to make is, without weighing into the answer to those 2 questions, but the key point is, when we call out the China threat, when we talk about military modernisation and build-up, cyber attack, sabotage, we're not talking to China. We're not thinking for a minute that we can dissuade Xi Jinping from his course. We're talking to the Australian public, because the decisions that will be made to make Australia resilient won't always be made around cabinet room tables. They'll be made around dining room tables and boardroom tables by Australians who need to be equipped to understand what they are combating so that they can have the innovation and the resilience to combat it.
And you're getting a lot of head nods around here. I'll go to Ross.
We need a season of honesty. I agree entirely with Catherine. We've got to be frank. I think the Australian public has a right to know, and they're not being told the challenges we really are facing. And so we need frank discussions. We need some briefings. The media, in particular, need to be brought into the tent and briefed in some detail. This has happened in earlier generations, not necessarily perfectly, but it certainly needs to be done now. And one of the reasons for that is we're talking about a situation which is not us sending forces to the other side of the world. We're talking about actually potentially having to fight in our own region, and in fact, the community suffering some direct attacks on our own territory. So what we've got to do is we've got to get informed. We've got to get strong. We've got to get scary, and by that I mean we need to selectively invest in some things that cause the other guy to change their calculations.
And Alexander, we saw that, didn't we, in Ukraine? People were not ready for war. They believed that Russia would not act.
Well, in 2014, no one expected that anything would happen, and no one even understood what has happened. But it was way too late to act and even seek that international support. So the partners were not ready to support to the extent that we've seen since 2022. But then there was 8 years to prepare, and the nation was preparing, the public was preparing, but also the defence. And I think that's what important is to continuously take in these lessons and actually learn and continuously adapt and innovate. And I think that's one of the most important aspects. We should not be that complacent, because the Operation Spiderweb can well happen anywhere in the world these days. So it's not only about the threats from outside, it's also thinking about the country within, and also thinking about how can we actually defend ourselves, what those capabilities, what are those gaps and innovations, and working with defence industry, for example, with research and development institutions, with academic institutions, because one of the most important assets that we have time and we have resources compared to Ukraine, and we can develop and do it right now.
Yeah, Chris, Ross was talking about changing the calculations of others, and of course by building our own strong sovereign force, we can hope to deter and deny an aggressor from our shores. But we could never spend enough money or build enough capability to change regional calculations. And I might be dwelling on or labouring this point too much, but I ask the panel and your viewers to think about what the region would look like without the US. It would be a completely different region, and we wouldn't be talking about Taiwan. That would be all over now. People like Alex and I have attended, and others probably, the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, a big gathering of many countries each year, and all other countries ever waited for at that conference. I'm sure they were just waiting, hanging off the opportunity to hear my speech. But what they wanted to hear is the US guy, whoever that was at the time, to come along and say, hey, we are here to stay. And that has to remain our absolute focus. And as I said in the beginning, that's in part what AUKUS is about. That's in part what spending more is all about. It's not just about capability, it's about demonstrating to our closest ally that we are prepared to lift our weight. Peter.
An honest conversation with the Australian people led by our government. A Prime Minister that's capable of picking up the phone to the President of the United States. I think we now need to look at a new security treaty with Japan, and we need to look at a significant rapid investment of funding into the current Australian Defence Force to make the current force as strong as it possibly can be.
I agree with most of the comments, but I think we need to stop seeing our own defence through the lens of the US. The US is an important partner, but we need to stand up for ourselves a little bit, develop a degree of autonomy, and have the ability to protect ourselves to an extent. And I think that hard and rapid investment in capability that can do that, we talk a lot about deterrence, we also just need to be able to respond. Integrated air and missile defence, having conversations around strategic resilience, and honestly, starting to build ships, starting to build missiles, all of those things. Yes, we need to inform the public, but we actually need to get that stuff happening as well.
I just say I wasn't saying that. I just want to make sure that's understood. I spoke about building our own sovereign capable defence, enough to deter and deny. But from a regional perspective, we are a relatively small player, and we are doing all those things, by the way.
I wasn't saying, we're not doing all those things. We are not doing all those things.
We're aspiring to do all those things.
We are not funding, we have no integrated air and missile defence that would last us for more than a couple of days, and that's probably being very kind. I wasn't saying you were saying that, but we often think about this conversation, we go straight to the alliance. And I think what the US is telling us about defence spending is you need to be more self-reliant, and that's what we should be focusing on.
All this is great, and I don't disagree, but none of it will happen without a significant change in mindset and the culture of zero risk that now pervades pretty much every bit of Australian society, unfortunately. I mean, you talk to Europeans now, they see us as a very low-risk culture, which is something coming from Europe. We need a clear statement from the Prime Minister, and when we get a full-time Defence Minister, that we in the Department of Defence must take more risk in procurement, in innovation, to cut the amount of time it takes to develop capability, to fail more in learning about new ways of thinking and fighting and supporting ourselves, and nurture a spirit of innovation that connects military, industry and society in this country.
I think part of the problem with the current public debate in Australia is this issue of President Trump, which I think is an extremely superficial issue. I mean, I think whatever I think of President Trump, and I think a lot of positive things about him as well as some negative things, we shouldn't be judging our geostrategic interests on the basis of whether we like President Trump or not. He is elected. He is the democratic representative of the people of the United States, and he is committed, as you can see, to a strong alliance network. He's been building up the capabilities of the European allies. He's been doing what he can to try to end the wars that there are. And I think the government here in Australia has made a major mistake by playing, if you like, politics with this issue of the dangers of the region and losing the balance of power, because they don't want to be seen to be too close to President Trump. I mean, I think it's a very superficial and dangerous game for the Australian government to play. They need to be telling the public of the importance of the alliance with the United States and our other allies in no uncertain terms, and telling the public this is about making our region secure, because there won't be any threats to Australia if our region is secure. We need to make the region secure, and our alliance with the United States is axiomatic. It's fundamentally important to that. And it's nothing to do with some game about whether you like President Trump or whether President Biden was gaga or whatever it is. Forget all that American political stuff and focus on the geostrategic circumstances of Australia.
Probably three things that in some way summarise some of the things other colleagues have been saying. During the Cold War, we had a practice of developing a society-wide war book. Commonwealth, state, territory governments. Today, more infrastructure is privatised, so you need to bring private entities in. How would you keep Australia functioning? How would you ration food? How would you ration resources and the like? How would you protect in cyberspace, etc.? So something around civil defence, national resilience. That's no regrets, relatively low cost. We should just do that anyway. Secondly, I agree with what others have said. Look at the current force and try to beef it up as much as you can in the time available. We should take 27 seriously, because that's what Xi has said is a target date for him. So we should be looking at what we can do to bulk up. And some of that involves the rapid acquisition that was talked about before. On the question of the alliance and talking to the Americans, we need to be very clear, and I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, about what they intend. We need to have a conversation with them now. If they want to fight from Australia, that changes the calculus of how you defend Australia and how you remain resilient within Australia dramatically. If they have forces stationed here that are conducting strike missions or conducting other operations, that completely changes how you plan the defence of Australia. That discussion needs to be happening yesterday.
I just want to pick up on Mick's reflection on our Defence Minister. I thought it was a little bit unfair. Enormous respect for Mick, but a little bit unfair, I thought. We've actually got two cabinet ministers now in defence, and I think there's a lot of work being done. And we've got, our AWDs now have both the naval strike missile and the Tomahawks. The list is very, very long. We're manufacturing missiles here now in Australia. I mean, sovereign capability is building, but it takes a lot of time. But the key point here is that we are on the catch-up. And there's a lot of blame to go around amongst the politicians. I mean, we talk again about the 2009 white paper. We recommended 12 submarines, and everyone cheered and everyone agreed. If the optimal pathway remains on track, we will get them 23 years after we announce them. And there are a number of examples just like that I could cite. So we need to fix this system. And on the issue of spending, you can put another $10 billion into the system tomorrow, but it's got to be someone's got to be capable of spending it. And the system as it operates now isn't capable of spending all that additional money.
That is an entirely different program, which we should have, if we gave them the money, with the Department of Defence be able to deliver us with the kind of capability that we need. But unfortunately, we are up against time at the moment. I think if I was to summarise, I would say that everyone around this table agrees that it all begins with a conversation with the Australian people, which is a truthful one. Can I say that no one around this table wants war? Everyone hopes for peace, but sometimes you do not get that choice, and a wise government plans for the worst case, not the best case. So hopefully we've begun the conversation that needs to be had with the Australian people, and thank you for joining us.